Okay, Carol, you want?
Thank you all for coming to this memorial ceremony. We're dedicating a stone to Max Chaim Friese, my grandfather. Can you hear me? Oh, it's so annoying. Before the Anschluss, 185,000 Jews lived in Vienna. By the time the Nazis goose stepped into Vienna, 65,000 remained. 112 survived. My grandfather, Max Friese, was not one of them. I grew up in New York City and I thought that I knew all the stories of my family, of my father and his brothers and sisters during those tumultuous times. But I hardly knew anything about my grandfather, except that he was a master tailor. My father and he had lost contact in the 1930s, possibly before. In 2011, my husband and I first came to Vienna, and I was curious about what happened.
Dankeschön, sehr nett. Kommt da noch eine, ja?
I was curious about what happened to my grandfather. Did he die a natural death? Was he a victim of the Holocaust? I went to the Central Synagogue where the Jewish archives are kept, and I handed the archivist my grandfather's name. He returned from his office with a sheet of paper. I read it numbly. It was from the Shoah database. It gave Max's date of birth and summarized his last 3 months of life. This is what I read. Max Friese was born in Zwanów, Galicia in 1868. He lived in this building over a Donhausstrasse 7. I understand this is the original building, and was arrested by the Nazis in July 1942. He was detained at an apartment on Pottmanningengasse 14/6. That was used as a roundup center. On September 10th, he was loaded onto Transport 40 for Theresienstadt Ghetto. He must have had a strong constitution, because he was still alive 19 days later. Then, on September 29th, Max was deported to Lublin, Poland on Transport BS, destination Treblinka death camp, where he was murdered. I was stunned. I don't know why I was stunned. I had deluded myself, I think, that he had died a natural death. He was 74 years old. I hadn't expected to learn such detail about his last days of life and his death. The Nazis, though, kept meticulous records. But it profoundly affected me in an unexpected way. I had always intended to write the story about my father and his exploits with the Nazis. He was a target of the Gestapo from 1933 until he left Germany in 1935. But there's more to that story because he was deported in 1938 from Belgium back to Germany. So I had always intended to write this story about my father, which I thought was rather a remarkable story about the will to survive and the ability to do so. Now I wanted to write about my whole family. My grandfather, my aunts and uncles, they all had gone through something. And so in order to do that, I had to do more research. I began to have my father's papers translated. My father had a trove of papers in a metal box. Among them were 5 letters from an Austrian diplomat in Munich who wrote to my father all through 1936. My father at that point was in Vienna for half a year. And once I had these letters translated, I was able to see that they were using code phrases and there was a lot of subterfuge, things I didn't understand what they meant. So I called the Austrian consulate in New York And I spoke to the Deputy Consul General, and she said to me, Carol, I must introduce you to Rudi Oxner, our historian in Vienna. And this is how I came to meet Rudi. A historian, an Austrian diplomat, a very modest man. I later found out he was also an ambassador of Austria to Ethiopia. And we began a correspondence, and we began to meet yearly when my husband and I came to Vienna. And what came of very formal correspondence, dear Dr. Mother Pearl, dear Dr. Oxner, became dear Carol, dear Rudi. And our friendship came into a collaboration to find out information about my family, who was Austrian born but lived in Germany. On one of my trips to Vienna, Rudi introduced me to a colleague of his who was an expert on Jewish life in pre-Anschluss Vienna. Rudi also searched the archives for information on my grandfather and wrote a summary for me, which gave me more details. By the way, he is the one that recommended me to this organization and suggested I lay a memorial stone. I also contacted, this is part of my research now, the municipal and federal archives in Germany and also in Belgium to get information about Nazi actions against my family. I learned, for example, all the dates when my family left Germany or Vienna. They left for New York, for Shanghai, for South Africa, some of it very surreptitiously. I also learned additional details about my grandfather. Max Frieser, as I said before, was born in Zwanów, Galicia. Rudi told me that Zwanów was part of the Czech Republic. That I didn't know. I thought it was part of Ukraine. That piece of information made everything fall into place for how he and my grandmother had met, because she was born in Oresko, Czechoslovakia. I think that Max must have been an intelligent man who planned ahead, and he wanted a future, a better life for himself and for his future family. He began at the age of 16 a 7-year apprenticeship in tailoring and became a master tailor. I imagine that a 7-year stint of studying something has to be equivalent to a college education today. Maybe not a college education of 100 years ago, but a college education today. He completed his training at the age of 23 and married his sweetheart, my grandmother, Toni Frieser, who was 21. They married in Halish near Bratislava, and Max paid an exorbitant amount of money for a marriage tax. It was equivalent to at least a year's salary to have a certified marriage. And this state-approved ceremony would be recognized by the city of Vienna and by the state of Austria. That permitted him and his wife to move to Vienna as legal refugees. It also ensured that their 7 children would be considered legitimate citizens of Austria, where they were born. Max set up his business as a master tailor, but he loved playing cards, and this led to the breakup of their marriage. My grandmother took their 7 children and moved to Munich. Max pursued her a year later. They reconciled and they lived together for the next 20 years, except for when World War I broke out. And then in February 1916, 48-year-old Max was drafted into the famous Hoch- und Deutschmeister 4th Regiment of the Austrian Army. He returned to Munich in 1918 at the end of the war, but they divorced in 1928, which was a highly unusual occurrence in those days. Max went back to Vienna alone. 10 years later, the Austrian Anschluss, and German soldiers goose-stepped their way into Vienna on March 12, 1938. All the anti-Jewish laws that had been enacted from 1933 until 1938 were immediately enacted here, which must have set the lives of the Jews here upside down. For my grandfather and his fellow Jews, it had to be especially difficult. For example, Max loved to play cards. He probably lived to play cards. But Jews were not allowed to enter cafes, so there weren't any card games for him anymore. Jews weren't permitted to use public transportation. They weren't permitted to sit on a park bench. And he was deprived of his way of making a living. Nobody used money to make clothing. They used it to buy exit visas. Then, in June 1942, Jews had to wear the star. A month later came the mass arrest of the elderly that still were here in Vienna. This was called the Great Action of July 1942. It was an international action and took place in all of Nazi-occupied countries. 800 miles away, in Antwerp, where my grandmother lived, Jews were disappearing. My grandmother ran from the mass roundup, but she was an old woman in poor health, and the exertion was too much for her. When she arrived at her daughter Tachi's house, she died in her arms. Hers was a death, though, of natural causes. I find it very ironic that my grandparents, who were separated and divorced and living in different countries, should die within a few weeks of each other from the same action in July 1942. I am here to dedicate this memorial stone for my grandfather, who was gassed and cremated in Treblinka. Nothing else, no gravestone, marks his life or his death. This memorial stone is the only acknowledgement that the grandfather whom I never knew existed and lived here. My entire family of today symbolically considers this stone to be also a memory of our grandmother Antony Frieser and our cousin Tachi, who was deported to Auschwitz. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very moving words.
So they deported him on Kristallnacht on November 9th, 1938. And it's interesting, all the German Jews getting off of the train were arrested immediately. My father had Austrian papers. They let him go. But he was arrested eventually, just within that same week in Aachen. So,
yes, there's so many stories.
Yeah.
Because my father-in-law, whom I sadly never met, is buried here in Vienna, was put into the Gur, the transit.
yeah, I know Gurs, because my uncle,
My father, he's talking about.
Carol, you can call me Carol.
Carol.
Carol Motherford.
You spoke beautifully.
He spoke beautifully. It was just, and we were hanging on every word he said.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of similarities.
Yeah,
My
that's-
father was from Belgium. I mean, not from Belgium. Ended up in Belgium.
And in
Arrested there.
45, it was sent to Helmut.
Do you know when he was arrested? Because chances are they
I
didn't
know
send him
that,
to Japan.
So we'll have lunch. I don't want to, because I'd like to communicate with you in New York. Sam turned.
Okay.
It's in the booklet, yeah.
Your coat is with Elizabeth.
No, I don't think it did. I just had to find the good things.
They're ready to move on.
You chain here? Or you just
You know something? I've been coming here every year because he does every year around this time he does a lecture on entrepreneurship at the University of Vienna. So we've made a whole bunch of friends. We come back. We enjoy coming back, and by coincidence, they are holding the ceremony here on on the week that we're here.
So what are you going to do, Sodom?
Jane was watching me last night, and I was stumbling over my words. And then
Nobody could tell.
all of a sudden, I didn't stumble.